Over the last lectures, we spent a lot of talking about transition and CSS transition because it's really super important. What, however, about our list? In this list, we're also, of course, adding and removing items, and it would be nice if we could animate that too. Because right now, if I add an item, it's just there, and if I remove it, it's just gone. What if we actually wanted to animate this? Well, we can do that. We can't do it with transition and CSS transition alone though. This wouldn't work. Instead, we'll have to use an additional component we can import from the React Transition Group package. This component is called Transition Group from React Transition Group, like this, /transition group is the subpackage. Now, transition group can be used in places where you output lists. So where you have a dynamic list of elements, like here in our unordered list. There, we can replace the unordered list element with transition group, of course also for the closing tag, like this. And then, by default, this would render a div in its place, so we can define the component property there conveniently to still render an unordered list element, so that we work with that, but then it will replace itself with this unordered list and still wrap our list items semantically correct. And then, of course, we had our list class. We can also still add this by simply adding class name as on any other element, which should be list. With that, if we save this and we go back, we see that it still works, but we get a couple of warnings here. Unknown event handler on exited, received true for non-boolean attribute in. Well, we're getting all these warnings because right now with our transition group, we're still wrapping a list of list items. And transition group can be used for animating lists, but only in conjunction with the transition or CSS transition component. They then both work as you learned it. So here we now can import, let's say, CSS transition to take advantage of these automatically generated CSS classes from React Transition Group CSS transition, like this. And now we can use that to wrap our list items. So here in my list items array, I can use CSS transition just like that. Wrap my list item with it, like this. Now I need to move the key to the CSS transition element here because that's now actually the item we're looping through. And now with that, if I save this, you see that we get different warnings now, that we don't have a timeout. And if I click this, that it can't find enter. The enter class it essentially tries to add to the CSS class. Now the reason for all these errors is that CSS transition isn't configured correctly. We need to pass class names, let's say fade, and we also need to pass a timeout. Let's say here we just hardcode 300 milliseconds. If we now set up CSS transition correctly, now it's actually doing something, it's animating something. Well, it's not animating anything, but it's not throwing errors anymore. And the important thing is that now we can start animating this. Now, you might miss the in property we used before to control the state of our transition. The special thing about transition group, and essentially the only thing it does, is it's able to handle multiple items. It determines whenever one element in the list changes, if it's removed or added, and it will then manually set the in property on the wrapped transition or CSS transition component, so that you don't have to control the in property, because you of course can't do that. You're having a dynamic list in the end. Now, with that, the management of the in property is the main difference. So now we can define our fade animation, since I set up fade as the trunk here, in, let's say, the list CSS file. And I'll add fade enter. Let's say this is my starting configuration where I set the opacity to 0. Then I'll add fade enter active. So whilst the animation is running, I want to animate to an opacity of 1. And I'll do this with a CSS transition. So setting transition here for opacity over, let's say, 0.3 seconds, since I defined a timeout of 300 here, over 0.3 seconds with a ease out timing function. I'll then add fade exit, and there we'll start at an opacity of 1 still, and then fade exit active. There I'll set my opacity to 0, and I also want to add a transition here to animate this. With all these changes, if we save that file, if I now reload my application and add an item, you see it's animated in. We have this fade effect. And the same for removing it. There it's also animating an element out, just, well, the wrong one here due to the way we manage this list with this key, which really is just the index. But still, you can see the animation works. And if you have a list where you have a better key, it would also not update this incorrectly. So this actually works. It's animating list items out too, as well as in, as you can clearly tell here. So this is the transition group component. In the end, just a helper automatically setting the in property on CSS transition or just transition. And then you work with these transition and CSS transition components just as you learned it over the last lectures. And with that, you got a powerful way of animating lists in your Pocket too.